Hey everybody, welcome to Bible class today. Have you ever heard of Old Faithful? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about Old Faithful and God's faithfulness. So let's get to it.
Boom, ba-boom, 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 boom, ba-boom, boom, ba-boom, 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 boom, ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom.
When we read the account of Noah in the flood, it's important to remember that God made promises to Noah and to his family, really, and he made good on those. So I wanted to look at a few of those promises, and in one of them he promised Noah, he said he would save Noah and his family, and he would save all kinds of animals on the earth. Look at this promise. This is from Genesis chapter 6, verse 18. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Then he tells him to bring the animals. Also down in chapter 7, verse 6 through 9, Noah was 600 years old when the floodwaters came on the earth, and Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives entered the ark to escape the waters of the flood, just like God promised. Pairs of clean and unclean animals, of birds, and of all creatures that move along the ground, male and female, came to Noah and entered the ark as God had commanded Noah. So God promised, he said, I'm going to save you and your family and all these kinds of animals. And they all entered the ark. But that wasn't the only promise. He also promised that seasons would continue for all time. So we're going to read, this is a little bit longer of a reading. This is from chapter 8, verse 15 and following. It also tells us that God did save Noah because we see Noah came out of the ark. So God said to Noah, come out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons and their wives. Bring out every kind of living creature that is with you, the birds, the animals, and all the creatures that move along the ground, so they can multiply on the earth and be fruitful and increase in number on it. So they came out. Verse 20. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking some of all the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. So God said, all of the seasons that you know, whenever we have cold weather and we have the springtime, the things come to life and bloom. We have the summertime when it gets brutally hot here in Texas. Then we have the fall when it starts to cool back down and the leaves turn. All of those things, they will never cease until the very end. And we still see those things happening today. God is faithful to keep that promise. But then he has one more. This is one that we haven't talked very much about yet, but you've probably know about this already. But we're going to talk about it today. This comes from chapter 9, verse 8 through 17. He made a promise that if you go outside after it rains and you look up into the sky and the sun is shining, you might still see this today. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, I now establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that was with you, the birds, the livestock, and all the wild animals, all those that came out of the ark with you, every living creature on earth. I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. You've probably seen rainbows. In fact, it's been raining some recently, and you may have been able to go outside and see a rainbow then. And that is a sign of the covenant that God made with all living things on the earth. That he would never destroy the earth by flood again. God is faithful. So we talked about geysers. So I want to talk just a little bit more about that, and then we're going to do a science experiment. How many of you have ever heard of a geyser? Do you know what it is? You may not, but there may be one in particular you have heard of. You may have heard the term Old Faithful. That's actually a name that's given to a geyser in the Yellowstone National Park. What's interesting about that geyser and why they call it Old Faithful is depending on the length of time that it erupts and shoots water into the air, they can use a formula that tells them down to the second when is it going to erupt again. And I think that's interesting, that this elements of the earth that God created are so faithful to do what they're supposed to do that you can calculate it down to the second. And that's only something that God created to do what it's supposed to do. How much more faithful is God himself if the elements that he created are faithful to erupt? So today we're going to use some of those elements that God created, a little bit of the properties of gas, air. Whenever it heats up, it expands. But if you trap it inside of something and it expands, it pushes force on the container. So we're actually going to use that and do an experiment and create our own geyser. So we're going to go over to the kitchen table for that. And I want you to be thinking about all of the faithfulness of God and how he was faithful to Noah, and how whenever we use the things that he created, they are faithful too. So we'll go do that, and then we'll come back here and talk just a little more. So in order to do this experiment, you're going to need a few things. I've got this is an old pickle jar, and I've got it just a little bit of water in there, maybe a third full, and then I've drilled a hole in the top of the lid. I think it's a 1/4 inch hole so that I can stick a straw through there. And then you're going to need some Play-Doh. I've got some Play-Doh here, and you will need a straight pin. This is a little bitty pin that you'd use like in sewing. You can see the little black bead on the end maybe. Anyway, small straight pin. And then I have some insurance here. Duct tape. So, what we're going to do is create a gasket with Play-Doh. So I'm going to stick this in there. I'm going to take my Play-Doh and I am going to stick it around the opening here with this straw. So I am pressing all that tight around the straw as much as I can to make a gasket there. And then I'm going to take a little bit of Play-Doh. I'm actually going to poke it into the end of the straw, this, so that I've got a little plug in the end of the straw. That's where I need my straight pin. I'm going to poke a small hole all the way through that little plug, hopefully. Okay, there we go. I had to squeeze the straw to keep the Play-Doh from going down the straw and not letting me poke a hole. So I'm going to make sure that my Play-Doh is good there, nice and firm around the straw. Now my hot water here. So this is cold water in the jar, and then I have hot water here. And this jar needs to seal. That's important. So my hot water, I'm going to put this in here, and this is just out of the tap. It's not like refrigerator cold. So the idea, we're going to heat up what's inside the jar, and that will create pressure, and the water, if you can see, starts coming up out of the straw. See if I can keep my Play-Doh seal here. My fingers. Yeah. So this water is still cold, so it's not going to burn you. But the jar, the water in the pan is not cold. Pretty cool, huh? So that's how a geyser works. And what's neat about this is exactly the way things that God created are supposed to work. The air inside expands when it gets hot, and it creates pressure inside of the jar, and that pushes on the water inside of the jar, and then the water comes up out. And that's basically how a geyser works. And it's interesting that these are doing exactly what God made them to do. So God is faithful whenever He makes promises to us, and the things that He created are faithful to do what He created them to do, just like something like this geyser. I want to show you another option. If you had a trouble with the Play-Doh, because the Play-Doh is kind of squishy and when it gets hot and wet, it falls apart. This is where I had the duct tape. So you can probably see on there, I have wrapped duct tape or Gorilla Tape around the straw and then really squeezed it through the little hole that I drilled until it's very tight. You can barely see. So what I did was take my tape and I tore just a little thin strip like this. And then I took that and then I wrapped it around my straw, and I probably cut it in half, wrapped it around and then tested the fit, and then I put a little bit more and tested until I could just barely get that straw in there so that it would fit nice and tight. And then I still have the little Play-Doh plug in the end with a hole from the straight pin. So we're going to try this one more time. Seal the lid nice and snug, put it in our hot water, and then we'll see what happens.
1 hour later.
Just takes a little time for it to get hot. But there you can definitely see we have a geyser. Pretty cool. So the key is you just have to have hot water in your pan, cool water in the jar, and then make sure that there's a good tight air seal around your straw. And once you've got that, it will work. You just have to give it time because the water inside has to heat up so that it heats up the air inside, and that's what causes the pressure. So let's go back over to the couch and we'll talk a little bit more about God's faithfulness and how maybe this applies to the promises of God that we've been talking about. So if those things work, just hot water and cold water in a jar and a straw and all those things, if those will produce a little fountain of water and it's faithful to do what we think that it should do, how much more faithful is the God that we serve, who said to Noah, I will save you, your family, and all kinds of animals. Not every single animal, but all kinds of animals. And He did, as we read. Then He said, seasons will continue for all time until the earth is no more. We can look outside. Right now, the season is changing from summer to fall. He's still faithful in that. And then finally He said, I'm going to create the rainbow in the clouds, that we can see that, and it's a reminder to God of His covenant with us, and we can see the rainbow and remind ourselves of that covenant as well, and God's faithfulness. And in all this time, He has not flooded the entire earth to destroy all life again. So when God makes promises, He is faithful, and even more faithful than Old Faithful. Thank you for coming to Bible class today, and I hope that I will see you again on Sunday. Have a good week.